Philadelphia, capping a week of protests and outrage over the police shooting of a black man in Wisconsin. Civil rights advocates will highlight the scourge of police and vigilante violence against black Americans at a commemoration of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. About 100 people from the Delaware Valley gathered Friday morning to head to the nation's capital as thousands are expected at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Friday, where the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his historic, "I Have a Dream," address. And they are gathering on the heels of yet another shooting by a white police officer of a black man, this time, 29-year-old Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, last Sunday, sparking days of protests and violence that left 2 dead. Father says Jacob Blake, black man shot by police, is paralyzed. "We've got to create a different consciousness and a different climate in our nation," said Martin Luther King III, a son of the late civil rights icon and co-convener of the march. "That won't happen though, unless we are mobilized and galvanized," King said Thursday. He and the Reverend Al Sharpton, whose civil rights organization, the National Action Network, planned Friday's event, said the objective of the march is to show the urgency for federal policing reforms, to decry racial violence, and to demand voting rights protections ahead of the November general election. Related, 3 shot, 2 fatally, during Wisconsin protests. To underscore the urgency, Sharpton has assembled the families of an ever-expanding roll call of victims: George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, Garner, Blake, among others. Following the commemorative rally that will include remarks from civil rights attorney Ben Crump, who represents several of the victims' families, participants will march to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in West Potomac Park, next to the National Mall, and then disperse. Turnout in Washington will be lighter than initially intended due to city-imposed coronavirus pandemic restrictions that limit out-of-state visitors to the nation's capital. To that end, the National Action Network organized a handful of satellite march events in South Carolina, Florida and Nevada, among others. While participants march in Washington, Sharpton has called for those in other states to march on their U.S. senators' offices and demand their support of federal policing reforms. Sharpton said protesters should also demand reinvigorated U.S. voter protections, in memory of the late Congressman John Lewis who, until his death on July 17, was the last living speaker at the original march. In June, the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives passed the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which would ban police use of stranglehold maneuvers and end qualified immunity for officers, among other reforms.